Now, small blood vessels. This is a completely separate issue from osmolar draw. Completely separate. Arteriolar constriction and dilation has to do entirely with hydrostatic forces, pressure of water, not osmolar pressure. In the kidney, we filter about 20%. Of glomerular filtration rate is about 20%. The filtration fraction. We put about 600 mLs into the kidney in renal plasma volume, and about 120 mLs come out as glomerular filtration rate. Even though we filter 20% of the kidney, the pressures between the afferent and efferent arterioles stay the same. How can you have the same hydrostatic pressure at the beginning and the end of the afferent arteriole if you just filtered 20% of it? How can you have the hydrostatic pressure be the same if you've lost volume? Constriction of the arterioles. The constriction and dilation of arterioles maintains hydrostatic pressure constant. And you need constant hydrostatic pressure to have a stable biological system. So hydrostatic pressures are maintained by the dilation and constriction of various arterioles. And you notice not venules. Not venules. Why not dilation and constriction of venules? Because veins don't have circular muscular layers around them that can dilate and constrict. Arterioles do. Venules don't have circular muscles around them, but arterioles do. When you open up an arteriole, it's the same as turning on the faucet in the bathroom or the kitchen. You're increasing the flow. You dilate the arteriole, more flow in there. If the artery stays the same and you increase the flow, the artery diameter stays the same and you increase the flow, what happens to the pressure? The diameter later on stays the same, but I increase the flow into it. What happens to the pressure? Will it go up or down? I increase the flow into the same size artery later on, it increases the pressure. More volume, same size later on, more pressure. That's how we control hydrostatic pressures, by increasing and decreasing, by dilating and constricting arterioles, not venules. Also, large arteries can't constrict and dilate. The aorta doesn't constrict and dilate. It's too big. The same way, on major highways that have 4 and 6 lanes, they don't have stoplights. Stoplights is for small roads. Big highways don't have stoplights because you can't control flow that way. The big highway is like a big artery, huge artery, an aorta, a femoral, a brachial. You don't constrict and contract. You don't constrict and dilate the femoral artery. You constrict and contract teeny arterioles, just like small roads have stoplights to control flow, not major highways. Same idea. As a matter of fact, an artery like the aorta, if you live at the size of 5 microns, which is the size of a red blood cell, a large artery like the aorta is the equivalent of transcontinental flight, about 600 to 800 miles an hour, 600 miles an hour. A modest size artery is about 300 miles, 250 miles an hour. And small arteries is like driving your car at 120 miles an hour. So that's the relative velocities. It's only when you get down into small arterioles it becomes a normal size highway, 55, so to speak. So there's no resistance between the capillaries and veins because capillaries don't have muscular layers in them. Arterioles do. So when we talk about afterload, we really mean arteriolar resistance, the smallest arteries before you get to the capillaries, but not between capillaries and veins. So if you think about it, large arteries don't constrict and dilate, capillaries don't constrict and dilate, veins don't constrict and dilate. Small arteries, arterioles, they constrict and dilate. But because of the back pressure, they do control the pressure all the way back up into the left ventricle. If you constricted every one of these arterioles out here, you can control the back pressure into the heart. But arterioles are what change. Capillaries are highly permeable, and they're permeable because they're not surrounded by a muscular layer that can dilate and constrict. I got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that the capillaries don't dilate and constrict. There's no muscular layer to control flow. The good news is that things can diffuse in and out because they're very thin. They're too thin to have a muscular layer, but they're thin enough that things can diffuse across them. That's the point. They're so thin that proteins can leak out into the interstitium because capillaries are very thin. It's like little side streets outside the building. You don't stop your car on the side of a huge major highway. You got to get off the highway. But you can stop your car on the street where you live to get in and out of your car. The lymphatic system there picks up proteins that are removed because lymphatics are very, very loose. The walls of lymphatics are so loose that proteins can get into them. Now, this thing here on the next slide can look seemingly complex, and when you put numbers in it, it will feel complex. But the idea of it is not complex because, in fact, the idea of it is what I just said, hydrostatic pressure. The idea of it's very easy, and the good news is it's just addition and subtraction, no multiplication, no division. So it's the kind of mathematics that medical students can handle. Now, the most important forces here are hydrostatic pressure, not osmolar, hydrostatic. Hydrostatic, like a water hose, like a garden hose, like a fire hose. Hydrostatic, like sucking up stuff with a straw. And oncotic. Now, oncotic could be a misnomer because we have oncology, which is the study of cancer, has nothing to do with it. And we have oncotic in here, where oncotic here means protein. So why don't we just say oncotic equals protein and life will be good. Now, this symbol that looks like pi is the same thing as saying oncotic. The major thing here, your mantra for today, is hydrostatic pressure. Om Namah hydrostatic pressure. Om Namah hydrostatic pressure. Om Namah hydrostatic pressure. Satyamev Jayate. Truth shall prevail. Hydrostatic pressure, here it is. The forces that go in and the forces that go out. The forces for filtration. The forces for filtration is the hydrostatic pressure that's in the capillary. The hydrostatic pressure is in the capillary plus the oncotic pressure that is in the interstitial fluid. Okay, for filtration is the push out of the artery or arteriole and the pull out. It's the push out of the artery and the pull out. Hydrostatic pressures in the arteriole push fluid out of the arteriole. Oncotic pressure in the interstitial fluid pulls the fluid out of the capillary. That's the forces for filtration. And the forces against filtration, also known as forces of reabsorption, the forces against filtration would be the hydrostatic pressure in the interstitial fluid, plus the oncotic pressure in the capillary, because the forces against filtration are the hydrostatic pressure in the interstitial fluid, which pushes the fluid back in, and the oncotic pressure in the capillary, which pulls this in. Okay? Cannot review what you never knew. If you took physiology in college, you'll think that this is very easy and you're done, just fast forward. If you didn't take physiology in college, or you fell asleep during that class in medical school, and you'll think, the good news is it's not going to change. You know, it's not going to change. Also, the other thing is this. Don't try and do the nephrology section without understanding this, okay? Because you're not going to understand it without understanding these two things. This is the very basis upon glomerular filtration rate. The very basis upon glomerular filtration rate is understanding that oncotic pressures and hydrostatic pressures between the both of these control how much fluid is filtered. In the kidney, what happens to hydrostatic pressure between the beginning and the end of the arteriole? Let's say that we have an afferent arteriole, which is a $5 word for to, and an efferent arteriole, which is a $5 word for from. And man, I'm not getting $200,000 in debt to say to and from. I'm getting $200,000 in debt to say afferent and efferent. You filter 20%. What happens to the hydrostatic pressure between the beginning and the end of that capillary? The answer is nothing. How can you lose 20% of the volume but have no change in the numma hydrostatic pressure? Numma hydrostatic pressure. And the answer is constriction and dilation of these arterioles. That's how. You have constriction and dilation of the afferent and efferent arteriole to maintain constancy. Constancy. Not until the sun excludes you do I exclude you. Not until the waters refuse to glisten for you and the leaves refuse to rustle for you shall my words refuse to glisten and rustle for you. Constancy. For she is wise, if I can judge of her. And fair she is, if mine eyes be true. And true she is, as she has proven herself. Therefore, like herself, fair, wise, and true, shall she be placed in my constant soul. That's the Merchant of Venice, right? Merchant of Venice, right? Merchant of Venice. So that's it, constancy between the beginning and the end. Numma hydrostatic pressure. So let's look at the formula. No. Oh, that was scary. There's a formula on the next slide. I can't do it. It's a formula. Because I think we were just about to understand it, and there's a formula. There's a scary formula. Man, there's like Saw 5. Saw 5, episode 5. The calculations and the equations. It's like House of the Dead. Yeah. House of the Dead. Okay? Equations jumping out at me. I don't want. Equation. Filtration. No, too much. I can't. No, forget it. Filtration coefficient. Get rid of that. That's too much for me. Fluid movement. Why do they have to call it Q, man? Q equals flow, okay? Q equals flow. All right, it is. And Q of the F means flow of the fluid. Why can't we just say that? You know what I mean? Why can't we just say flow? Why do we have to say FQ? I don't know. That's what I think about this FQ. All right, so the thing is that the flow of the fluid, if you're getting scared by this formula, is what I just said. It just said, well, let's go back. The forces for filtration is the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary, pushes it out. The oncotic pressure in the interstitial fluid pulls it out. Oh, look at that. It's the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary, and the oncotic pressure is the forces for filtration. minus the forces against filtration. And that's just a net. That's it. That's the point. The point is, this formula is what I just said before. Hydrostatic pressure in the capillary pushes fluid out. Oncotic pressure in the interstitial fluid pulls fluid out. And the hydrostatic pressure outside the capillary is pushing back in. And the oncotic pressure in the capillary is keeping the fluid in. And you're just taking the forces for and the forces against filtration, and that will give you the rate of flow, the force of flow for the fluid. And this concept you got. So ready? Just keep looking at the formula for a second. It'll be like desensitization, okay? Just desensitize yourself against this formula, and it'll be over, okay? Oh no, I can't. Yes, you can. No, no. Just look at it for a while. This is cognitive behavioral therapy. You don't have to like it. Just pretend like you like it, and eventually you will like it. Now, this next slide simply gives you a sample calculation. It says, can you look at some numbers and calculate out a net filtration flow? And this means that you basically have to take the forces here that are for filtration, and say basically the forces that are for filtration, which is the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary and the oncotic pressure that is in the interstitial fluid, which is 26, is for filtration, and subtract out what is the hydrostatic pressure within the interstitial fluid and the oncotic pressure in the capillary, and say 22, and say 26 minus 22 equals 4. And it says basically you have to just go through the calculation and be able to say, what are the forces for? The forces for is the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary, and the oncotic pressure in the interstitial fluid is 4 minus the other two, 26 minus 22. Now that's why the first one is 4. Now here it says, well, now switch it. It may not be terribly clear from the slide. And it basically says switch it so that the interstitial hydrostatic pressure is now minus 2. Switch it so that the interstitial hydrostatic pressure is minus 2. So that means that this one over here, that hydrostatic pressure that was 2, change it to minus 2. That's why it changes, okay? So this next one, we erase all the other calculations. We do change this to minus 2. Change this to the interstitial hydrostatic pressure is minus 2. So now we have the forces favoring filtration is still 26, and the forces against filtration, let's see. Oh my goodness, minus 2 plus minus 2 plus 20. Minus 2 plus 20, how do you add minus 2 plus 20? Minus 2 plus 20 is 18. So now we changed it from 26 minus 22 to 26 minus 18, and that's how we get the 8 difference. And this is just an example of saying what happens when you alter those pressures. In both of these cases, the net result for filtration is that they'll both end up in filtration of fluid out of the vascular space. It's just that one of them gives a smaller amount of force of filtration, and the other one gives a larger amount of force of filtration. It's basically saying that as you decrease the hydrostatic pressure in the interstitial space, as you decrease the hydrostatic pressure in the interstitial space, you will increase the forces of filtration. In other words, the hydrostatic pressure in the interstitial fluid is opposing filtration. As you decrease the hydrostatic pressure in the interstitial fluid, you're making it easier for things to filter out. And that's all it's saying. The lower the hydrostatic pressure in the interstitial space, the greater the forces of filtration.